Well, hey there, and welcome to Wedding Planning Simplified. Hopefully, you are having a great day. I'm Amy. I'm here from Unmistakably You in London, Ontario, and I am here today to, first of all, welcome any of our new viewers. I know we've had a lot of people get engaged over the holidays and join our group. So if you are one of them, congratulations. I am so happy for you. I know that a lot of engagements have recently happened, and we are here to give you the resources that you need to navigate your wedding planning with a minimum of stress and overwhelm, and hopefully some kind of grace and sanity left at the end. So today we are here talking about venues. This is a little mini series that we're starting. It's going to take us through the rest of January because often if you're newly engaged, this is where you start. You are probably going to start with some kind of a venue search. I mean, that's not always the case, but it's pretty hard to determine a date if you don't have a venue. I mean, sometimes you have a date in mind and you'll find a venue that matches, or, vice versa, but it's commonly where you will start your plans. So we wanted to pop into your lives for the next few weeks and talk about the differences between different kinds of venues, which is what we're going to talk about today. And then next week, if you join us same time, same place, 1:00 next Sunday, we're going to talk you through how to do a site visit at a venue. So as always, if you have comments or questions, don't hesitate to pop them into the comments. I'm using a third-party streaming app here. So if you haven't authorized it to see your comments, I won't be able to see them live, but I'll always respond to anything after the fact. Or if you have authorized StreamYard to see your name and your comments, I'll be able to see them right here on my screen, and I can respond to them in real time. So if you have any questions that you can't post now, or if you're catching us on the replay, always feel free to contact me after the fact. You can send me a private message here, or you can email me, amy@unmistakably.you.com. So hopefully you have had a great week. It's been snowy here in London, and much as I don't enjoy the snow, we've definitely been able to make it out tobogganing with the kiddo a couple of times. So that's been a lot of fun. If you're planning a winter wedding for this year, I know you're probably dealing with some challenges with the new restrictions. So as always, we're here to help with that. Also, if you need some support through that. If you're planning for next winter, that's awesome. We're going to talk about some winter wedding tips coming up in the near future also. So don't hesitate, as always, to reach out, but let's jump in right now with our discussion today about understanding the different kinds of venues. There are tons of venues out there, and always they have different pros and cons. And I certainly don't mean to say that everything is going to be cut and dried and everything is an exact science. There are venues that don't neatly fit into any of these categories, but essentially, there are kind of three different categories that I see most venues fitting into. And so we're going to go through those today and just make sure that I kind of cover the differences between them, the pros and cons of each, so that you have some idea of what to look out for if you are starting to investigate these venues. So like I said right off the top, if you're newly engaged, it's so exciting, but it can be really daunting to know where to start. And that is why we're here. So we at Unmistakably You are wedding planners first and foremost, and we are here to support not only our clients, but also our community through planning your wedding, because we know that not everyone has the means to work with a wedding planner, and we still want to be able to give you helpful resources that can help guide you through the process. So that's what we're doing here. We're here live every Sunday at 1, and hopefully you'll join us and we can help you out. So like I mentioned, also, let me know in the chat where you are in your plans. If you are newly engaged, pop that in there and let me know, and I'll send you an awesome congratulations. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask those in the chat, or like I said, after the fact. Now, essentially, the three kinds of venues that you're likely going to find are all-inclusive venues, what I like to call semi-inclusive venues, and then DIY or do-it-yourself venues. And as I mentioned, it's not a neat little box that everything fits into, and you're certainly not going to be able to necessarily search semi-inclusive venues through Google and have much pop up, because this is maybe my own made up term, but in my spaghetti factory of a brain, this is kind of the way I like to deal with venues. And when I'm sitting down to talk with a full planning coordination or full planning couple, this is kind of where I like to start, is getting a sense of what kind of a venue they're looking for, because that's going to shape the kind of wedding they have, but also the way that they navigate the planning process, because the parts of it that are left up to you are certainly dramatically different between all-inclusive venues and DIY venues and everything in between. So we'll jump in first to all-inclusive venues. And these are typically venues that provide many services, not necessarily all services, but many services. So in most cases, what we're talking about here are catering, bar service, and linens. They usually have some kind of recommended vendor lists. A few venues that we've worked with require you to stick with their lists. And the reason for that is just to make sure that they don't get some, fly-by-night Kijiji DJ in there that has never done a wedding before and then messes everything up, and it potentially reflects badly on their venue. But not many of them have exclusive partnerships. They'll usually just have a recommended list, although some all-inclusive venues do include things like your DJ, your officiant, or your decorator with your package. And so those aren't necessarily services that they specifically provide in-house, but they will work with an exclusive DJ company, or they will work with an exclusive officiant. Now, again, depending on the venue, you can sometimes ask if it's okay for you to bring in your own DJ or bring in your own officiant. And in most cases, they will allow that, but know that the package price probably won't change in that case. So when I say all-inclusive venues, I'm kind of talking about usually most hotels, most golf courses, most event facilities. And I'll say qualifying terms a lot, like most or often, because like I said, not everything is always cut and dried and fits into a nice, neat little box. But typically, if you're going to a hotel, they are going to give you an all-inclusive package. I have never walked into a hotel that says, oh yeah, it's totally cool for you to bring in your own food. Usually they'll say, well, we can make the food of your choice, but often they won't, or most often they won't allow you to bring in your own caterer. So there are obviously some pros to this kind of venue. If you're looking at an all-inclusive venue, it means that you have a lot fewer vendors to coordinate yourself. So you're not organizing separate caterers and bartenders. You're not getting your own liquor license. You don't have to worry about additional insurance, because hotels and golf courses have insurance up the wazoo, far more insurance than you could ever get as, Jane Doe looking to get event insurance. And so typically you have fewer venues. Oh my gosh, let me English properly. Sorry. Fewer vendors to coordinate on your own, particularly if you have booked a package that does include officiants, DJs, other services like that. Typically, all-inclusive venues will have some kind of a venue coordinator. And I'm going to say venue coordinator just to highlight that, because the job of the venue coordinator is very different from the job of an independent coordinator. And I've talked about that in the past, and we have an upcoming blog on that as well. But the venue coordinator is exclusively responsible for the items that the venue is supplying for you. So they're going to make sure that you have as many chairs and tables as you need, that if you ordered white linens, you get white linens. They're going to make sure that if you've requested sangria on the bar, there's sangria on the bar. They're going to make sure that the foyer is set up for cocktail hour at the appropriate time. But what they're not going to do is help you to coordinate with an independent florist. They're not going to go to your off-site visits with your DJ, with your officiant. They're not going to have nearly the amount of detail that an independent coordinator would have about your wedding day, but they certainly are on site on the day of to make sure that everything is running smoothly from their end. You'll have a fair amount of communication with a venue coordinator, not nearly as much as you would have with an independent coordinator, but they are there for support when you need them with the venue-related items. Now, oftentimes, there's no setup or teardown for you, again, depending on how much of your own decor you're bringing in. If you have all kinds of independent little tchotchkes and items for decor, like framed engagement photos or your own candles or your own card box, those kinds of things. Often the venue coordinator will set those up for you, but not always. So it's always important to double check that. But it usually takes a lot of the pressure off of you in terms of setting things up on the day before the wedding or the morning of and tearing them down after the wedding. Particularly if you're at a hotel or a golf course, they're going to do all of the table clearing. They're going to take any elements that you did bring in. So let's say you provided your own table numbers. They're going to take those at the end of the night and they'll put them on a table for you that you either have to clear out at the end of the night or you can come pick up the next day. All-inclusive venues will always have on-site staff, so there are always people there to take care of things for you. If somebody drops a glass on the dance floor, there's going to be somebody who swooshes in with a broom and cleans that up for you. And the benefit to an all-inclusive venue is that it can be, in many instances, almost a one-stop shop. I mean, you're not going to walk into a venue and just check, sign your name to a contract and you get absolutely every element of your wedding covered. You still have to go gown shopping and you still need to make sure that you do all of the wedding party things. But in many cases, you have fewer vendors to coordinate, which is a very big benefit for a lot of couples, especially in this busy day and age. Now, the cons of a all-inclusive venue are that often it's the priciest option. You'll often end up paying a package price that will include your food and beverage and usually your linens. But you need to make sure that you don't misinterpret the phrase all-inclusive. So it can be a little bit misleading. You'll want to look for things that they don't include in the price. So for instance, a lot of all-inclusive venues don't include an open bar at cocktail hour. They'll include a champagne punch or a sangria or a sparkling toast, something like that. But they won't include an open bar so that your guests can go and have whatever they want to drink during the cocktail hour. Often they'll have like a 4-hour or a 5-hour open bar in addition to wine served at dinner. So you want to make sure you really know exactly what you're getting when you're booking a bar package with an all-inclusive venue. And we've talked about that in the past, the difference between consumption bars and host bars, and we'll talk about that again in the future. But often when you're paying an all-inclusive price, it's in the venue's best interests, not your best interests. So you often find that you'll be overpaying for alcohol, but the benefit of that is that you know exactly how much that package is going to cost, and there's not going to be any reconciliation at the end if a guest, if your guests drank way more than was expected, and then all of a sudden your bar tab is a lot higher. Often, all-inclusive packages don't include any kind of a late night meal either. So just be on the lookout for the entirety of the day before you jump in with both feet and sign on that dotted line. Make sure you know exactly what's included. You've envisioned the day. If you want an open bar at cocktail hour, if you want that late night food, you need to make sure that you check if it's in the package. Some of the inclusions that all-inclusive venues offer are not actually things that you're going to want. So they've had their marketing team put it together to seem as appealing as possible and to look like they have as many features as possible. But I've seen a lot of all-inclusive venues include centerpieces, and you're like, oh, great, centerpieces. That's going to save me a ton of money on my florals. Except that what they're including is a cheesy little artificial centerpiece that was made 20 years ago with flowers that they got on sale. And it's maybe not as appealing as what you would originally think when they say they're providing the centerpieces. So make sure that you know exactly what it is that they're including and whether or not that's something that you actually want. Often, and not always, this is always dependent on bookings. With any venue I've ever worked at, they're able to let you in the day before to set up and the day after to tear down if there are no other events. And that's very venue specific. But in my experience, often hotels and golf courses and event facilities have an event on the Friday and an event on the Sunday if you're getting married on the Saturday. So oftentimes you're limited in terms of being able to come in a day early or a day later to set up and tear down. So just be careful about that. Oftentimes also, especially if you're getting married at a hotel, there may be more than one wedding on site that day. That may not make a difference to you at all. But if you want it to be all about you, the spotlight's on you, and you don't want any confusion for your guests, whether they go to banquet hall A or B or C, you may want to consider that before you look at things like hotels or some of those larger event facilities that have multiple halls and are hosting multiple weddings at a time. You'll also want to watch out for additional fees that might not be included in that all-inclusive fee. So sometimes there's a room rental fee. Usually there's a minimum food and beverage spend. So if you haven't reached that, they may charge you an additional amount on top just to make sure that they've covered their costs for the day. There may be music licensing fees. Here in Ontario, we have SOCAN and Resound. Those are just the fees that you have to pay. It's basically the gratuity that goes to the artist if you're playing recorded music. There may be cake cutting fees. There may be additional bar fees. Like I said, if they're not providing an open bar during cocktail hour, but you want to do that, they will happily do that for you, but they will also charge you a premium to do that. There may be on-site ceremony fees. So in a lot of these venues, there is an on-site ceremony location. In a hotel, it might be a separate meeting space or hall. If you're at a golf course, they may have an outdoor space, but sometimes they'll have a ceremony setup fee because they need to set up the chairs and tear them down, and they need to pay their staff to do that. So watch out for on-site ceremony fees. Things like gratuity and taxes are sometimes included in the overall all-inclusive package price, but sometimes they're not. And that can be an incredibly huge extra expense if you haven't accounted for, yay, Ontario, 13% sales tax. And then often it's a 15, 18, 20% gratuity, depending on your location and the site that you're looking at. I have seen gratuities up to 20%, and that is an astronomical chunk of your budget if you sign without realizing that it's not included. You may also have limited flexibility to bring in your own fill in the blank here. So if you wanted to make your own wine and bring it into a hotel, there are usually a whole bunch of hoops that you have to jump through. You'll have to get your own special occasion permit. You'll need to close down their bar while you're serving your own wine. So like I said, there may be exclusive partnerships with some vendors. There may be recommended vendor lists, but it may be a little bit more difficult for you to bring in your own decorator or your own wine or something like that at an all-inclusive venue. And again, all venues are different, so ask the question, don't assume. This is just what I've seen in the past. So moving into our second category of venues, I call these semi-inclusive venues. And this is a little bit more of a gray area. It's a little bit harder to clearly say this is a semi-inclusive venue because some barns, for instance, are semi-inclusive, whereas some barns are DIY, which is our third category. So these are typically venues that provide some services, and those will vary, but not all services. So they may have in-house food, but you bring in your own bar, or vice versa. They may have their own bar, but you can bring in your own caterer. They may provide you with a lot of the rentals, tables and chairs, but you don't have access to their linens or their decor. Or some semi-inclusive venues will allow you to bring in your own catering, for instance, but it has to be one of their approved caterers that you choose from their list. Pardon me, I have a little bit of a cold. So semi-inclusive venues, like I said, bit of a gray area, but some barns will fall into this category, some halls, some museums, some multi-purpose venues. And if you're familiar with London, Ontario, when I say multi-purpose venue, I mean somewhere like, for instance, the Civic Gardens complex, where it's owned by the city, it's rented by the London Horticultural Society, but they also rent out the space for weddings because it's a great way for them to supplement their income. Same thing with Museum London. So Museum London is a local museum that functions as a museum, but to supplement their bottom line, they rent out the space for weddings. So semi-inclusive venues can look very different. The aesthetic of a barn is obviously very different than the aesthetic of a museum, but that's what I mean when I say semi-inclusive venues, is that, for instance, again, if we go back to Museum London, they do the bar for you. They will allow you to bring in your own catering, but you are limited to bringing in caterers off of their approved list. Whereas somewhere like Fanshawe Pioneer Village here in London, I would still categorize them as a semi-inclusive venue because they provide tables and chairs, but They have much, much more flexibility in terms of bringing in caterers, and you can run your own bar there as well. So somewhere like that is really just kind of on the verge between a semi-inclusive venue and a DIY venue. So the pros of semi-inclusive venues are that you usually have a lot more flexibility in your vendor selection. So they tend to not have a lot of ties to exclusive officiants or DJs or decorators that you need to use. So often the world is your oyster. You can bring in any DJ or any decorator that you like, often. They are also often more budget friendly, especially where food and beverage is concerned. Pardon me. So if you can run your own bar, you are going to save an absolutely huge amount of money. It does come with the flip side of that, which is that you need to look after licensing and permits and insurance as well. But you will save a lot of money that way. Or if you can bring in your own catering, because food and beverage, like I said, is the biggest expense with any wedding. And if you can control those expenses by bringing in your own suppliers, your budget is going to thank you in the end. Some of these venues may be a little bit more flexible for setup and teardown. Now, of course, again, it always depends on availability. There are barns here locally that are booked Friday, Saturday, Sunday, every weekend. And so even though it's a semi-inclusive venue, you still can't access the day before or the day after. Whereas there are some of these venues that book the whole weekend so that you are able to go in and set up on the Friday, have your wedding on the Saturday, and come back and tear down on the Sunday, which is great because oftentimes when I see couples go for for semi-inclusive venues, they're doing a lot of their decor themselves, and having that day to set up beforehand is really, really valuable. Now, of course, there are some cons as well. There are more vendors to coordinate in most cases. So you're going to have to go out and find your own caterer. You're going to have to source your own bartenders. Then you're going to have to make sure that you have glassware for those bartenders to serve out of. And you have to have a special occasion permit. And you have to have additional insurance. And you have to make sure that everybody has everything that they need instead of the venue coordinator doing that if you were having a wedding at a hotel or a golf course. They may not have much on-site staff. Again, it very much depends on the venue. A lot of semi-inclusive venues that we work with, again, I'll come back to Museum London, they have a setup crew and they have an on-site coordinator, but that on-site coordinator is not really available to you very much on your wedding day. She will be in her office dealing with her other stuff. She'll make sure that the staff comes in and sets up the tables, but beyond that, she's not really on site that much during the day. Same thing with somewhere like Civic Gardens, for instance. So there are staff, there is someone there to deal with any emergencies should they arise, but the staff generally is pretty limited. The thing that I find most confusing about semi-inclusive venues is that it's not always really clear what your responsibilities are and what the venue's responsibilities are. So you need to make sure that you have really clear communication with whoever's doing their booking, whether that's some kind of a venue coordinator or the owner of the barn or whatever it is. Make sure that you're really, really clear about where their responsibilities end and where yours start, particularly with setup, cleanup, and like I mentioned before, those alcohol licenses and permits. And finally, we'll move on to the third category, which is DIY venues. Now, these are venues that provide either very few or no services. You're usually just renting or using the space. So you'll need to provide everything and coordinate all of the moving pieces. Now, when I talk about DIY, again, there's a little bit of gray area. I mentioned, some barns could slide into either semi-inclusive or DIY, depending on what they're allowing you to bring in and what they provide. But in this case, we're talking about some barns, tents, and private property. And private property is a big one. We do a lot of weddings on private property. Now, the biggest pro is when you're dealing with a DIY venue that you have the ultimate flexibility in terms of your vendor choices. You can bring in whoever you want from whatever category. It's not like at some semi-inclusive venues where they're giving you a list of 4 caterers to choose from, but all of those 4 caterers basically have the same per plate price. So you're not really going to have the opportunity to save very much money because you're so limited in your choices. Whereas here, if you're at most DIY venues, you can bring in whatever you want. You can bring in a food truck, you can bring in, Sue's Down Home Country Catering, you can bring in, Sue's expensive New York City inspired catering. It really doesn't matter. You can choose to go as high end or as affordable as you'd like with most vendor categories to suit your own budget. You can create your vision from scratch. So if you're getting married in a tent, you can make that tent look like whatever you want it to look like. Of course, that comes with a price tag and usually a talented decorator, but you can really kind of make it your own, and you're not stuck with the carpet that the hotel has, because let's be honest, I don't know who chooses hotel carpet, but wow, it's usually pretty loud. So you can have your vision. You're not limited to the color scheme of the hall or the carpet that they've installed or the fact that there's not a separate space for ceremony and reception. So you can create your own vision from scratch, and you can save a huge amount on food and beverage, like I talked about with semi-inclusive venues, especially if you're running your own bar. You're going to save a ton of money, but again, more work and more setup behind the scenes on your end. Now, usually, especially if you're on private property, you can set up the day prior, you can set up the week prior. I've done weddings on private property where the process of, turning the drive shed into a wedding wonderland has taken a month. And that's cool, because if it's your property, you can do what you want with it. I often see couples who are getting married on, like mom and dad's farm, and mom and dad have been landscaping for a year. There's no better incentive to get your landscaping projects done than having a wedding on your property, let me tell you. And you can usually tear down the day after, because again, you own the space in many cases. And so it makes it a lot more flexible for you in terms of bringing in your own decor, doing your own setup. But the flip side of that is that it's not always as cost effective as you might think. So I often have couples come in and they say, oh yeah, we're going to get married in the backyard. We're going to bring in a tent. It's going to be so affordable because we don't have all these astronomical venue fees to pay, which is true. But what a lot of couples don't realize is that by the time you rent a tent and a washroom trailer and a dance floor and generators and lighting and tables and chairs and linens and china and glassware and flatware and all of the things, it can often equate to $50 or more per person. And so you're often not saving as much as you think. In addition to having so many moving pieces that you have to think about, you're going to have all of the coordination falling to you, or falling to your parents if it's at your parents' place, or falling to your wedding party. And so you need to think about who's going to manage everything on the day. If the caterer shows up and they don't know where to go, who's going to direct them? If the floral delivery gets dropped off and the flower colors are wrong, who's going to fix that? If the DJ just doesn't show up, who's going to make those phone calls? Whereas at semi and all-inclusive venues, often there is some kind of staff on site to deal with those kinds of things. Usually at a DIY venue, the staff is you. So you need to be very cognizant of how much you're willing to do in the days leading up to and on the day of the wedding. Now, if you're on private property, there's a whole host of other things to think about, like, is there sufficient power? What about washroom facilities? Where will guests park? Is it accessible? If you're at somewhere like a barn, for instance, or if you're at a venue like, again, locally here in London, we have, I'm thinking of Elsie Perrin Williams, which is what I would classify as a semi-inclusive venue, but they actually have a house, a facility where you can have your wedding inside, in which case it's kind of a semi-inclusive venue. But if you choose, you could put in a tent on the lawn, in which case then I would kind of slide it into a DIY venue category. So there are all kinds of different things to think about. But at somewhere like that, where it's not private property, if you're at a barn that does weddings regularly, or if you're at somewhere, like I mentioned, Elsie Perrin, where they do weddings, they'll have thought of these things. They will have sufficient power. They will have washroom facilities. But if you're building a facility from the ground up, a wedding facility on your backyard, then you need to think about all of these things. You also need to think about a weather backup because a lot of DIY venues are going to be tents or barns, and you need to make sure that if the weather is horrible on the day of your wedding, you have some kind of a plan. You also need to really think about that CYA factor, the cover your ass factor. You need to make sure that you have insurance, especially if you're on private property. Like I mentioned before, hotels and golf courses have insurance up the wazoo. So they're covered. You don't have to get additional insurance policies there. But if you're getting married at your own house or at your parents' house or at grandpa's barn, you need to make sure that you have the insurance to cover you in case anything happens. God forbid, but if someone drives drunk, or if someone, I don't know, falls down a hill, you need to make sure that no lawsuits and no liability are going to come back on you. So you need to make sure that you have insurance and your liability covered. Food and beverage savings could be huge, but oftentimes, like I mentioned, they could be offset by the rental and decor costs because you're literally building a venue from scratch, and that does cost money by the time you add up everything that you're going to have to bring in. And finally, similar to what I said before, who's going to manage your day? There's no venue staff or minimal venue staff. And so you need to make sure that you have a plan for what happens if the head table backdrop falls over, or what happens if you need to make a last minute decision to move your ceremony from outside to inside, because there is no venue staff provided at most of these DIY venues. So hopefully that answers some questions. I know that this is a huge and kind of daunting idea, and really nothing influences the feeling of your wedding day more than your venue. I don't want to overstate the importance here, but it really does set the tone for every element of your day. So it's an important decision, and it's a decision that you shouldn't rush into. I'm hopefully going to give you the tools that you need by the end of the month with our lives for the next 3 weeks to make your decision on what kind of venue you'd like to look at, to give you the tools for what to do when you go to your venue and how to do a venue site visit. That's next week. And hopefully just clarify some of the questions that you have. So as always, thank you for joining me. If you have questions, I'm more than happy to chat. You can post a question in the comments following the video. If you're catching the replay, feel free to email me, amy@unmistakably.you.com, or you can send us a private message here through Facebook. I look forward to seeing you next week. Again, if you're newly engaged, so exciting, congratulations, and don't hesitate to let us know if we can help. Take care. See you next week.